another edition of MMI Live. I am, of course, your host, Jessica Zitch, Managing Director here at Mitchell Martin. I'm joined today by Sandeep Maira, Founder and CTO of Raven Risk AI. Sandeep, welcome to the broadcast. Happy to have you. Very excited. We're going to be getting into generative AI momentarily. It's what you all came for. But before we get started, wanted to quickly introduce Sandeep for those of you who are unfamiliar with his work. Sandeep is currently the founder and CTO of Raven Risk AI. Raven is a comprehensive AI platform for commercial credit, leveraging advanced Gen AI and machine learning techniques. Previous to Raven, Sandeep was the managing director of Strategic Systems, at Options Clearing Corporation, held a slew of leadership roles in financial services, including head of risk and compliance at BNY Mellon, held a number of risk technology functions at JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, and Lehman Brothers. The list of accomplishments could go on and on and on, Sandeep. You're quite an accomplished individual. But let's give the people what they came for. So today we're going to be chatting a little bit about generative AI. It's obviously a very hot topic item these days. But what we've heard a lot recently and where many organizations are starting to struggle is with their strategy of how to implement generative AI. Weighing the risks and challenges, kind of trying to understand how to get their hands around it in a way that's not going to leave their company open to, unnecessary risks, data, leaks, things like that, but also not get left in the dust by their competitors who are starting to really evolve and take this on as a key initiative. So, as you think about it, and as you, have been a technology leader, specifically in risk, as you think about that evolution, what is some of the short term, I guess, if we think about this in short term, medium term, long term, what's some of the corporate Gen AI strategy that we can look at in the short term? And even when you're talking short term, are you talking, is that a year? Is that 2 years? Like, what does that timeframe roadmap usually look like?
Oh, yeah, then thanks for that, Jess. And so firstly, thank you so much for having me on your broadcast. Really, really appreciate it. Just diving right into it, in terms of the short term, as part of my role as a CTO and co-founder of Raven AI, we have the opportunity to talk to a lot of different financial firms, like from some fairly large ones to mid-sized ones. And I think the universal stature that folks have as a baseline is to candidly just understand the tooling or like the power of Gen AI in the short term, right? Like what is it even about? I think there was a lack of knowledge till about a year ago, and I think in the last year there's been I think a lot of financial firms have made a lot of progress in just understanding, right? What can it actually do in the short term and so forth. And now, one of the things I think that is pretty important is to gain that education and understanding, play with essentially like it in a safe space, using in a sandbox environment, which is, I would say, isolated from, anything related to production or anything related to actual decisioning. Literally a sandbox-like environment that is secure and safe and does not expose the outputs to external parties, for example. So that's one thing that we found to be candidly quite useful. It sounds really basic, but pretty much any major mid-sized to major player in finance that we've spoken to, has had to go down that path initially over the last, I would say, year or so. In terms of basically the dimensions that I think people look at in the short term, it's a combination. I think you kind of alluded to this, actually, a combination of cost, benefit, and risk. Typically in most initiatives, it usually comes down to like cost and benefit. It comes down to risk to some extent, but this is, I think, a uniquely differentiated technology where the risk of leveraging it, and I'll talk about that, in a little bit, is actually pretty high than most. And that's mainly because the accuracy, unlike other software technologies, is not really as high as some people thought it might be or would be. So I think that's the downside of where a lot of these large language models and Gen AI technologies stand today, is that they're very powerful, but if you're looking for usage in regulated industries such as finance and maybe healthcare. And if you're thinking of using it eventually for decisioning, you got to be pretty accurate. Like you can't have, decisioning based upon outputs that are not, let's call it 95% plus accurate. So I think essentially it's this, the three dimensions I would call is cost, benefit, and risk. And that's where I think, candidly, the cutting edge of research in the space of finance and risk is currently occurring, is trying to optimize between those three things.
I like what you said, kind of about keeping it in the sandbox, and as you're dipping your toe into that pool of possibility, doing so in a really confined environment where if something does go askew, there's no risk to your organization. You're all
Basically,
right.
just it's like essentially like a closed lab environment without essentially exposing that lab environment to any business impact. Exactly right.
Yeah. When you're thinking about it from a leadership perspective, who is typically driving that in an organization? Like who are you needing to get on board to really push that forward in that short term, kind of near term strategy?
Yeah. So one thing that we found is that there's, I would say, broadly speaking, two ways that firms have been approaching it. Maybe three. So I'll actually, maybe the one of them is a variant of the other. So let's say three. So I think the first one is that some firms have established like a central coordinating organization, like a center of excellence type of thing. And there's a couple of reasons they've done that. One of them is that they found that there's so many things that can be done or explored using Gen AI in terms of like even the research part of how it can be useful, that they need to prioritize their resources. They can't have every group in the firm spend, let's say, 30% of their time exploring Gen AI because they've got BAU work and other work to be done as well. So in some firms, they've actually set up these CCOEs for a few reasons. One of them is to actually ensure that they prioritize the efforts within the firm in terms of what should be explored and first, and what can be explored maybe later. So that's one. The other reasons that they've established that is that it acts essentially as a little bit of a clearinghouse of information. So like what other people are doing within the firm, and also those COEs, if done right, can often connect technologies and research outside the firm that's happening in AI, because the AI space is moving incredibly quickly to people inside the firm. So it acts as a, like I would call it, a research / innovation clearinghouse for the people in groups inside the firm, and to what's happening in terms of innovation outside the firm. So I think broadly speaking, that's one of the major, I would say the more advanced firms arguably have set up COEs. That would be my recommendation. Another reason that they've set it up is to manage the risk. We touched upon that a little bit as well, so that so when they prioritize these projects, they typically go with projects that or POCs maybe is the right word, that are not overly risky in the short term. They typically tend not to approve ones that are very risky or that have a very long time horizon in terms of benefit. The second paradigm that we've seen, which is a little bit less structured, is that there's some sort of federated group that's not centralized. Like essentially, like they've got to do a project and using Gen AI in the company, like they have a committee of some sort that gets together like once a month, and they basically approve or disapprove projects, but they're not a standing COE. And the third one is where it's really decentralized, where essentially each group is kind of a little bit left up to its own devices to try to figure out. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, because innovation can happen ground up too and bottoms up too, but it's one that's a bit less structured, where each group is sort of left to figure out to some degree on its own what to do, and then take it from there.
Yeah, it actually, those three strategies, we've done a lot of work in intelligent automation and RPA, and it kind of follows that too. Some organizations did the full blown COE, have a centralized, a center of excellence. Some did the kind of hub and spoke or federated model, and others really adopted into that citizen development program where, that innovation can come from the bottom up, but sometimes it is a little bit slower and kind of generating those wins, because again, it's decentralized. So so as we start to look at the medium and the long term as an organization, and how do you how do you strategize around that? We've already got our safe space, our sandbox. We've identified what Gen AI could do. We feel somewhat comfortable with what we're finding in terms of wins and things like that. What's the next step? How do you take it into that medium long-term solution?
Yeah, so I think, so building upon the first step, like, you essentially then take a look at the different types of POCs that you have. You've engaged hopefully with some of the industry, players and the art of the possible in terms of what's doable in the short term that could, give value. And then you expand upon those to then take it from a sandbox like environment to what I would call probably like a test environment. Like, so like actually using it, exposing it maybe to internal users, not to external users. And I'll get to that in a second. To see basically like, how impactful that could be. So you've done some POCs, you can see that, in a very closed environment, it can potentially be useful. Now you want some internal business users even in your firm to leverage essentially or play essentially themselves with what can be done from a business value perspective, taking it a step further. So I think essentially like most of the cases that like we've seen that people are focusing on for the medium term tend to be ones that can be taken to production, are not ones that involve high risk decisioning, particularly in finance. So they include things like using it for internal customer service purposes, chatbots, and the reasons for that are that they tend to be lower risk, right? So like essentially like if you're using it for knowledge retrieval is a really big one. So an example is that, like there's most firms, particularly larger ones, have a huge corpus of information of all different types. So a common example that we see is that, they've got customer service agents, for example, and, they've got all kinds of different information, but it's typically in all these different databases that are hard for them to actually retrieve information from in real time. Now, through, I would say, technologies that connect the data sets, but also through Gen AI that is able to extract information summaries, you can apply essentially Gen AI to these disparate data sets within an organization, and then supply those summaries to customer service agents. The reason that I think firms are doing this is really twofold. So one reason is that it improves productivity because, like it can very quickly summarize large amounts of information. And the other reason is that it's relatively low risk. I mean, candidly, if the information was directionally correct but wasn't like 100% precise, and if it's a subjective question that, let's say, like somebody asked, like it's not gonna cause a big issue, right? You're not basically using it for like high risk decisioning or for lending decisions. You're essentially giving somewhat subjective information to a customer about like a type of, let's call it like, what type of product that the firm offers, where they could go for help, in terms of like follow-ups and things of that sort. So I think that's basically in the medium term. I think in terms of production applications, knowledge retrieval is arguably the biggest, one of the biggest use cases. The other one, which I think you might be familiar with, is coding, software engineering rather, and software development. There's firms on the different levels of the spectrum on that. Some firms that are more worried about security, have set up essentially their own versions of OpenAI on their own sort of infrastructure, or rather walled off infrastructure, so that their employees can use it. And some don't let the employees use it candidly at all. Like, they don't want their employees to use essentially quite yet, Gen AI for coding purposes. But I would say broadly speaking, those are the two biggest ones in the medium term. And when I say medium term, I know you asked this question earlier, and this, in my mind, these things are moving quickly. So when I say short term, I mean like within the next year. Medium term, I mean within the next 2 years, and then long term is like 2 years plus.
Yeah, and I won't hold you to that, Sandeep, because I know these things are changing day to day. So if that accelerates or decelerates, we won't come for you with this timestamp today. I promise.
I mean, if I could predict the future 100%, like we wouldn't be sitting here. So.
I know, right? We'd be on a yacht somewhere. It'd be
right,
great.
exactly.
No, so we've kind of touched on those two, near term, medium term. So as we look at long term, and I know you started to kind of sneak in there, and teased external a little bit, but how do you think about that when we start letting it free on everything that it's touching in the enterprise?
Yeah, so that I think is getting to be like the in some ways that's going to be the biggest differentiator from a competitive advantage, right? Because if you think about the other use cases we talked about, yeah, sure, they improve productivity to some degree, but like if you look at an organization, typically, particularly in a financial institution, I mean, knowledge retrieval helps, but it's not going to be basically a game changer from growing your business, right? Materially growing your business. So I think that essentially the use case or the types of things that would be game changers, very broadly, I would divide into two parts. So one of them is productivity gains on the large sense. So not just for just customer service things or just software, but actually improving productivity of pretty complex business processes. That's one. And then the other one is to augment human decision making, which is to actually help humans come up with better decisions by having Gen AI provide advice, acting essentially as a trusted advisor. So I think those two things are going to be game changers from a, from a truly from a transformational perspective. And I don't think we're there yet. Like I said, I envision that happening. And again, don't hold me to this, but I envision that happening in the 2 year plus horizon. I mean, for what it's worth, the space that my company plays in is actually the last one, which is a little bit on the cutting edge actually of using it for improving productivity of some pretty high risk processes in firms, and also to help assist with high risk decision making.
Yeah, when I think there's hesitancy, right? And I think rightfully so in a lot of cases. So we are talking, like you said, about some high risk stuff. When you start getting into your external customer facing,
Exactly.
even I guess that actually, sorry. So I just had a different train of thought pop up. So we talk a lot in intelligent automation side about like human in the loop. There's always going to be a human in the loop component. Do you think that obviously right now that's happening with generative AI, but do you think we get to a point where within an enterprise that's not the case, where it is fully autonomous and functioning on its own, and there's not a human that's kind of checking that those outputs?
Yeah, to be candid, even though I'm a big proponent of AI and I think it's very powerful, I actually don't see that happening in anywhere, even in like the next 3 years. If you're talking like 10 years, I mean that's a whole who knows, right?
Sure,
But I
who
think
knows?
if you're talking about the next 3 or 4 years, I doubt it. I mean, there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is that is simply, I guess there's at least two reasons for it. So one reason is that you cannot sue a machine, but you can sue a company or a human. And so I think there is some hesitancy that in firms that that essentially they'd be exposing themselves to very uncertain legal risk if they basically use AI for decisioning or things of that sort without having a human at the end of the chain. Of the approval chain or decisioning chain. So that's one. And the other one is that the regulators, may not even allow it actually. Like, so for example, if you're using it for, commercial for credit decisioning, which is, something my firm is working on, and some of the types of firms that do credit, I think the regulators would be a bit, are let's say more involved in terms of approvals and regulation. And so in those firms, particularly like let's say banks, like large banks or even mid-sized banks, highly regulated. If you're using machine learning models to do credit decisioning, I don't think I'm aware of actually a single bank in the U.S. that has gotten approval to use Gen AI for independent credit decisioning purposes. There are other institutions, which is where things get a little bit interesting, which are not as regulated, that also make lending decisions, and because they're not subject to the same types of regulations, like they're moving faster in terms of using Gen AI for decisioning and things like credit decisioning as well.
Gotcha. Interesting. So I think that we've touched a lot about this, or we've danced around it a little bit, but there are obviously risks and challenges of implementing this, right? I mean, we've talked a little bit about some of the risks, but what are some of the challenges too that you're seeing or that you perceive, as companies start to take these, initial steps and then those more advanced steps throughout this process?
Yeah, so I think actually there's actually, besides the risk of like, so one of them, is like, I guess accuracy. So one of the things that I think is like almost a dirty little secret in the Gen AI space, but I think is starting to become more widely known, is that people think it's somehow like extremely like a precise and like very good at coming up with almost any answer, things of that sort. So I think if you divide up the Gen AI space broadly into the types of things that it's good at and not good at, it's very good at essentially things that are somewhat subjective in nature, that some people consider to be bordering on like human generation or human outputs. I know some people find that scary, but that's one aspect that if you just type a pretty complex question into ChatGPT, it'll come up with something that usually sounds pretty good. The part that is not so good at is actually if you're looking for answers that are very accurate in a space that is somewhat subjective. If you're compounding the two things. So an example would be like, let's say that you're looking for making a credit decision on a borrower, and let's assume that this borrower's got like a wide set of different sub businesses and whatnot. And if you say essentially like, can you give me the growth prospects of this borrower? Surprisingly, even with pretty high accurate input data sources, like it will often give you an answer that is 70% to 80% accurate, and the last 20% sometimes is materially inaccurate, which I think a lot of people don't fully realize today. I think that being said, I think people at senior levels of these organizations or AI experts know that is a problem, and so admittedly, that is one of the reasons why at the enterprise level people are not using Gen AI yet as an input into high risk human decisioning. Now that last problem, though, there's a lot of people working on it actively to get better and better. And candidly, the firm that I'm at, one of the main innovations that we're working on is actually to improve the accuracy to a level where financial firms would be comfortable using it as an input into human decisioning. So that is the cutting edge just now in terms of, I would say, research and accuracy of Gen AI is coming up with with recommendations and outputs that are of pretty high accuracy. So I think those are the things people should be careful about. One of the things is the accuracy. The other one is actually talent. I mean, candidly, and I think you might know this, is that like the talent race is just getting started. The reality is that everybody and their dog, including my dog, is talking about AI, right? And so so I think we're just at the early stages of what's going to be, I think, like a many inning race over the next few years. And I have to say that I think we haven't seen anything yet, not just in terms of the capability of Gen AI, but in terms of the talent shortage. That's, in my view, actually, the next 2-3 years there's going to be a huge shortage of, I would say, really, strong talent in this space. And that's partly because I think firms have been rightly so cautious to build large scale projects in Gen AI. But that is coming, and once that starts to ramp up, and I think it will somewhat exponentially actually in the next couple of years, then I think the talent is going to be, talent shortage is going to be a pretty big risk as well. And just as a side note, one reason that I think that the projects are going to start ramping up is that we talked to, from like I said, candidly, a lot of firms in the finance space, and like all of them are under pressure from on high, whether it's the board of directors of the firm or whether it's like this senior management of the firm to come up with some strategy, whatever that some is in Gen AI. Now, as they start, most firms haven't locked in on a strategy yet that's of any detail. As I said, many of them are just doing small POCs and things of that sort. But as they start to come up with approaches, they're going to be under pressure from a competitor perspective that to do something that's at least that is competitive with what the competitors are doing. And when that starts to happen, which we're starting to see happen, that's going to basically produce tremendous pressure on those firms to start hiring people with AI expertise. And so I think that wave is going to, again, I can't predict the future, but my guess is the next 1 or 2 years, the amount of talent, demand for AI expertise is going to rocket upwards. So I think that's the second one. The third one, which I think is going to resolve itself, the third, and maybe, if I had to choose three, maybe these are the three, but the third one is the cost. I know some people are concerned about that and the cost of GPUs. That, candidly, I think is going to start resolving itself. Hardware is, you can't make more people with AI expertise, but you can create more chips,
Sure.
So like, I think the problem is going to ease in the next, couple of years. So even before that, actually, I think it'll start to ease.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And to the talent shortage again, I keep going back to the RPA days, but we saw something similar in when RPA became hot in the market about 6 to 7 years ago. We couldn't find an RPA developer. Now, it's a lot less challenging to find that level of talent. But at the time, it was getting really creative for a lot of our clients on like how do we address this demand with such short supply. I think obviously generative AI presents new challenges because the engineering is so complex,
Yes.
and
Yep.
that's
Exactly.
the major difference here.
Yeah.
But there are that, and to your point, you want people who have had experience, right? When you're hiring a senior level resource for something so critical and something that can be theoretically very high risk to your organization, you want someone who's been there and done that. And since it is so new, you kind of have this chicken and egg situation of how do we find these people? So, well, I know we've touched on a lot. I think we could probably go on and on for a long time. For those of you who have not had a chance to check out Sandeep, his profile on LinkedIn, and obviously, as if you'd like to hear more, he's got so much knowledge in this space. Definitely a thought leader. So Sandeep, thank you so much for coming, for being a part of this conversation. I know that you have so much more to say. So if you are interested in hearing more, reach out to Sandeep on LinkedIn, connect with him there. You can also learn more about Raven Risk AI on LinkedIn. Sandeep, I don't know if you have anything further you want to mention about Raven as you're here, but happy to give you that platform since you're here.
Yeah, well, then firstly, thank you again for having me. And I agree. We could talk, for days on this topic. It's, I think of great interest, at least to me and a lot of people. I think in terms of, Raven, and I'm going to kind of probably just reinforce a little bit of what I said earlier. Like, our objective is to streamline, credit decision making using AI. And by streamline, I mean, improve the productivity so that firms can do more deals. It's not necessary to replace humans, but it's, essentially the ability for them to generate more revenue by being able to analyze more deals in the same period of time using AI. And the second one is to improve decisioning such that, like once you make a decision, hopefully it's a slightly better decision than a human in isolation could do with, let's call it, manual processes, right? So like, I think it's coming up with, more accurate decisions as well. So one last thing I'll say though about, which I think some folks don't fully realize yet because the field is pretty new, is that, and this happens to be true in Raven, but it's true, for other things, as other types of AI frameworks as well, is that the framework is actually agnostic to the domain. There's nothing, ironically, in Raven's code at all that is specific to credit. I mean, amazingly. And the reason for that is that it's a learning platform, right? It's AI, and so essentially, like all the credit-specific domain expertise and the framework is provided through domain experts, which essentially translates into how the model learns. You can take any other domain in principle. It could even be like, I don't know, even healthcare for that matter, and a doctor's diagnoses, and use essentially the same type of framework that we've been developing and have, let's call it a specialist doctor help provide input, and that would train this framework that we're developing too. So something to keep in mind is that you can create very powerful frameworks using Gen AI that are reusable and don't have to be coded to one very specific use case. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting call out. Now you've trickled our next session. I think I think you've teased our next topic. But yeah, for those of you that are following Sandeep already on LinkedIn, I would go ahead and give him a follow. If you're not following Mitchell Martin, also, we are leaders in the IT staffing space. Obviously, we're continuing to bring thought leaders like Sandeep, giving them a platform to tell practical, real life use cases, advice, lessons learned along the way, hopefully some pitfalls to avoid as we continue down this road together. But as I mentioned before, Sandeep, we won't hold you to anything time stamped here today if things change a little bit. But as of today, this is kind of how things are standing. So again, very much appreciated. Really appreciate your time. And for those of you watching, until next time, we'll see you soon.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Jess, and thanks to Mitchell Martin. You guys have been great. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks so much. See you next time.